The ground shook like thunder. July 14, 1944, Saipan. The volcanic soil trembled beneath the feet of Lieutenant Nakamura Hideki as he crouched in what remained of a sugarcane field, now stripped bare by weeks of bombardment. The air tasted of ash and copper. Around him, the surviving men of the 43rd Division pressed their bodies into shallow depressions, their rifles clutched like prayers. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, but it was not the heat that made Nakamura's hands shake. It was the sound, a sound unlike anything in his 8 years of military service. A metallic shriek, rising and multiplying as if the sky itself was tearing open. Then the world erupted. What Lieutenant Nakamura and thousands of Japanese soldiers experienced that summer afternoon was not the conventional artillery barrage they had learned to endure through years of combat in China and across the Pacific Islands. It was something the Imperial Japanese Army had no doctrine to counter, no training to survive, and no mental framework to comprehend. The M4A1 Sherman tank, equipped with the T-34 Calliope rocket launcher system, a ground-based vehicle firing rockets designed for ships and aircraft, now adapted to rain devastation across the battlefield with a speed and intensity that defied everything warfare had been until that moment. The Japanese military establishment had built its entire strategic philosophy on the calculated study of Western warfare. Their officers had analyzed the trenches of the Great War, absorbed the lessons of combined arms tactics, and developed sophisticated responses to conventional artillery, machine gun emplacements, and even aerial bombardment. The Imperial Army's defensive manual, revised in 1943, dedicated entire chapters to calculating artillery trajectories, identifying firing positions by sound and flash, and constructing fortifications designed to withstand sustained shelling. What it did not, could not, account for was a weapon system that merged mobility, saturation firepower, and psychological shock into a single platform. The Calliope represented not merely an evolution of existing weapons, but a fundamental reimagining of what ground combat could be. When the first Calliope units rolled off American assembly lines in 1943, even Allied commanders struggled to classify them. Were they artillery, armor, psychological warfare tools? The answer was all three and none. Mounted atop the turret of a Sherman tank sat 60 steel tubes arranged in tiered rows, each capable of launching a 4.5-inch M8 rocket. In a span of 15 seconds, a single tank could fire its entire payload, 60 rockets arcing across distances up to 4,000 yards. A platoon of 4 Calliopes could deliver 240 rockets in the time it took a conventional artillery battery to fire a dozen shells. The mathematical reality alone was staggering. The psychological impact was incalculable. Japanese soldiers like Nakamura had been conditioned to expect certain rhythms in battle. Artillery came in patterns, ranging shots, corrections, then sustained fire. Men learned to count the seconds between impacts, to judge when batteries were repositioning or reloading, to time their movements in the brief windows of relative safety. These calculations, born from experience and drilled into muscle memory, became survival instincts. The Calliope shattered these instincts. There was no rhythm, only chaos. No pause, only continuous thunder. The rockets did not whistle with the familiar Doppler shift of falling shells. They shrieked with a rising, oscillating wail that seemed to come from every direction simultaneously. Survivors would later describe it as the sound of 1,000 tea kettles boiling over, or a chorus of demons ascending. The tactical deployment of these rocket artillery systems reflected a uniquely American approach to warfare, one that prioritized material abundance and industrial capacity over manpower conservation. Where Japanese doctrine emphasized spiritual fortitude and acceptance of sacrifice, American strategy weaponized logistics. The M8 rockets were not precision instruments. Their unguided flight paths and significant dispersion meant they were wildly inaccurate by conventional artillery standards. But accuracy was not the point. The point was saturation. The point was to transform entire grid squares of terrain into zones where survival became a matter of random chance rather than tactical skill. A single Calliope barrage could blanket an area the size of 3 football fields with high explosive warheads, fragmenting metal, and white phosphorus. On Saipan, the Japanese defenders had constructed an intricate network of bunkers, caves, and interconnected tunnels, fortifications that had proven devastatingly effective against conventional assault. These positions could absorb direct hits from artillery and emerge intact, their defenders ready to cut down advancing infantry. American commanders studying the bloody lessons of Tarawa and Peleliu knew that reducing such positions through conventional means would cost thousands of Marine lives and weeks of grinding combat. The Calliope offered an alternative. On that July afternoon, 4 Shermans equipped with the T-30 Falk system advanced to within 2,000 yards of the Japanese main defensive line. What followed was not a battle, but an obliteration. Lieutenant Nakamura would survive the war, one of the few from his unit. In his post-war testimony to American military historians, he attempted to articulate what those minutes had been like. "We understood artillery," he said, through an interpreter in 1946. "We had faced American guns before. We knew they had more shells than we did, better supply lines, larger calibers. We accepted this. We built our defenses deeper. We trained our men to endure. But this was not artillery. This was as if they had taken the rage of their entire industrial capacity and compressed it into seconds. You could not count impacts because there was no space between them. You could not identify direction because the sound surrounded you. Men who had held their positions through days of bombardment simply broke. Not because they were cowards, but because their minds could not process what was happening. It was not warfare, it was something else." This psychological dimension was precisely what American ordnance designers had intuited, perhaps unconsciously, in their development of multiple launch rocket systems. The United States military had entered the Second World War with a tradition of pragmatic innovation, a willingness to experiment with unconventional solutions when conventional approaches proved inadequate. The Calliope, along with its contemporaries like the T-40 Whizbang and the truck-mounted T-27 Xylophone, emerged from this culture of creative problem-solving. Engineers recognized that the shock effect of massed rocket fire could be as tactically valuable as its destructive power, a weapon that could paralyze enemy decision-making, disrupt communications, and induce mass psychological casualties before ground troops even advanced represented a force multiplier of extraordinary magnitude. Japanese military analysts in their post-war assessments identified the Calliope and similar systems as emblematic of a deeper strategic asymmetry they had failed to recognize until too late. The Japanese war economy, strained by years of continental conflict and increasingly effective Allied blockade, operated on principles of scarcity. Every shell, every bullet, every ton of steel had to be rationed and optimized. Japanese artillery doctrine reflected this reality, emphasizing precision, economy of ammunition, and concentrated fire on high-value targets. The American approach, by contrast, seemed almost wasteful in its extravagance. Why fire 60 inaccurate rockets when a dozen well-aimed shells could achieve the same tactical objective? The answer lay in a fundamental philosophical difference. America could afford to be wasteful. More than that, American industry thrived on volume production. The same assembly lines producing automobiles and refrigerators in peacetime could be converted to produce rockets and launchers at scales the Japanese economy could never match. This industrial disparity manifested in every aspect of the Calliope's deployment. The rockets themselves were relatively simple devices: a solid propellant grain, a warhead, stabilizing fins. No complex fuses, no precision manufacturing tolerances. American factories could produce thousands per day using semi-skilled labor. The launcher required no specialized crew training beyond what tank operators already possessed. The system could be mounted or removed in hours, allowing Shermans to switch between conventional tank operations and rocket artillery roles as tactical situations demanded. This flexibility, this abundance of options, represented a luxury Japanese commanders could scarcely imagine. On the ground at Saipan, as Lieutenant Nakamura and his surviving men staggered from their shattered positions, they encountered the physical evidence of this disparity. The sugarcane field had been transformed into a lunar landscape, craters overlapping craters, the earth churned and rechurned until no original surface remained. Unexploded rocket motors jutted from the ground like strange metal flowers. The air was thick with the chemical stench of burned propellant and explosive residue, but it was the sheer quantity of debris that struck observers most forcefully. Fragments of rocket casings lay scattered so densely that one could walk dozens of yards without stepping on bare earth. Each fragment represented a missile that had traveled across the Pacific, been unloaded at the beachhead, transported to the front, and launched, part of a supply chain so vast and efficient that it could sustain such expenditure casually, repeatedly, across multiple theaters of war simultaneously. The symbolic weight of that abundance was not lost on Japanese soldiers. Throughout the Pacific Campaign, Imperial forces had operated under increasingly severe material constraints. Ammunition was rationed, food supplies dwindled, medical care became rudimentary. Japanese soldiers learned to value every cartridge, to make do with captured enemy equipment, to improvise solutions to supply shortages. They fought with a kind of desperate efficiency, knowing that resupply was uncertain and reinforcement unlikely. Then they faced an enemy that could afford to fire 60 rockets from a single vehicle simply to soften up an area before the real assault began. The contrast was crushing. It communicated a message more demoralizing than any propaganda. You are fighting an enemy whose resources are effectively infinite, whose industrial base can produce weapons faster than you can destroy them, whose logistical infrastructure can sustain operations of such extravagance that they use rocket artillery, designed for naval bombardment, on ground targets as a routine tactical option. This realization rippled through Japanese defensive planning in the war's final year. As American forces pushed closer to the home islands, Japanese commanders faced an impossible calculus. Conventional defensive doctrine was predicated on inflicting casualties at a rate that would exhaust enemy will to continue. But against an enemy deploying weapons like the Calliope, conventional defenses simply vaporized before they could engage. Some Japanese officers advocated for deeper withdrawal, for allowing American forces to advance and then cutting their supply lines. But the Americans had already demonstrated in the island-hopping campaign that they could establish and maintain supply infrastructure under the most challenging conditions. Others argued for massing forces for decisive counterattacks, but concentrating troops only created more lucrative targets for rocket saturation. The Calliope system saw its most intensive use in the European theatre during the winter of 1944–45, where it proved equally devastating against German fortifications. But it was in the Pacific, against the uniquely fanatical and well-prepared Japanese defenders, that its psychological impact reached its apex. Japanese soldiers had been indoctrinated with the concept of gyokusai, honorable death rather than surrender. This ideology had proven terrifyingly effective at places like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where Japanese forces fought virtually to the last man. Yet even this conditioning had limits. When the choice became not between dying honorably or shamefully, but between remaining conscious or descending into catatonic shock from sensory overload, even the most dedicated soldiers found their resolve tested. American after-action reports from Okinawa in 1945 noted an unusual phenomenon. Japanese positions subjected to heavy Calliope barrage showed significantly higher rates of surrender and psychological casualties than those reduced through conventional artillery or airstrikes. Medical officers examining captured Japanese soldiers found evidence of severe acoustic trauma, ruptured eardrums, concussive injuries, symptoms resembling shell shock, amplified to extraordinary degrees. The weapon was achieving its tactical objectives not just through fragmentation and blast effects, but through sheer overwhelming of human sensory and psychological capacity. The 60 rockets, fired in rapid succession, became a symbol of everything that separated the American way of war from its adversaries. Each rocket represented a small piece of a vast industrial engine: steel mills in Pennsylvania, explosive factories in Indiana, chemical plants in Texas, all operating at maximum capacity, feeding a military machine that could afford to expend resources at rates that seemed almost supernatural to those on the receiving end. The shriek of those rockets carried a message. Resistance is not merely futile, it is irrelevant. You are not fighting an army, you are fighting the accumulated industrial output of an entire continent, mobilized for a single purpose. In the decades after the war, as historians and military analysts studied the Pacific Campaign, the Calliope and similar weapon systems came to represent a watershed in military technology, the point at which firepower density reached levels that fundamentally altered the nature of ground combat. The lessons learned from these systems would influence Cold War weapons development, from multiple launch rocket systems like the M270 MLRS to area denial munitions and beyond. But in July 1944, on a devastated island in the Pacific, those implications were far from clear. What was clear to Lieutenant Nakamura and the remnants of his unit was that they had encountered a form of warfare against which courage, training, and tactical skill offered no defense. As the sun set on that shattered landscape, as medics moved through the ruins searching for survivors, the smell of rocket propellant lingered in the still air, acrid, chemical, foreign. It was the smell of a different world, a world where nations could afford to pour their abundance into instruments of destruction with such casual profligacy that even their enemies could scarcely believe it. The Japanese Empire had bet its future on spiritual strength, overcoming material disadvantage, on the warrior ethos outlasting industrial capacity. The shriek of those 60 rockets, repeated across 1,000 battlefields, was history's answer. Freedom, it turned out, could be measured in tons of steel and gallons of fuel, in the capacity to produce weapons not just adequate, but excessive, to deploy them not sparingly, but lavishly. The Calliope was not merely a weapon, it was a declaration, written in fire and thunder, that the age of industrial warfare had reached its terrible maturity, and those nations still fighting wars of scarcity had already lost.